The presentation will consider questions as it examines healthcare before it becomes scientific or a big business. Tom is a historian, a curator of mechanical arts at Old Sturbridge Village. He has worked as costume historical interpreter, trainer for the Cooper Shop, supervisor of the mills, coordinator of historic trades. If you go to the old mill where they're grinding the logs up into big logs, I can personally tell you I've seen him doing it. Tom is presented at museums and historical societies throughout the country. Tom.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me again. There's a chair available if one of you ladies wants to grab it. I won't need it again. Anyway, I want to emphasize that the title is A Brief History of Medicine. We could be here for months or years if we were getting into more detail, but we can do that. One thing, as Eric said, it's a pre-scientific world. One thing that I think we all sort of, or most of us, assume about medicine today in our own lives is that it's mostly based on science. There are certainly alternative healings and other things, but mostly we assume that our healthcare professionals are scientifically trained, and which is usually the case. But of course, for most of human history, there was no real science behind medicine, and people really didn't understand how everything worked. We still don't completely understand how the body and things that attack it and support it work. But we hope to use scientific method to learn more. But for most of the past, there was no real boundary between the spiritual and physical worlds. That was how things were explained, was by supernatural agency. And certainly the people that settled here in Massachusetts, originally from England, came here for religious reasons and certainly believed that God routinely took an active role in people's lives. Some of you may or may not believe that. A lot of people have their own various beliefs nowadays, as some people did in the past. You just didn't talk about them out loud, or that could get you in trouble. But anyhow, but nonetheless, usually there was an ultimate spiritual explanation for what couldn't be easily observed with the human senses. And while that's certainly the case in the past, consider how much a lot of people still use reliance on the supernatural. Not saying for good, bad, or indifferent, but I think a lot of us still rely on the supernatural, especially when health is not around. And for ourselves, for others, for our loved ones and friends, there's still an awful lot of reliance on the supernatural, even as either a supplement or a substitute, even in some cases, for scientific medicine. But in the past, there was a real blur between the two, and there's still, I think, a fair blur nowadays. But anyway, there is certainly a prayer link with medicine. I think when we're sick, we all hope for healing. A lot of people get much more religious when they or somebody near them are in especially serious health issues. These cartoons here, the Mad Magazine of the day, for those of you who can't read it, these cartoons are from the magazine Scraps, which David Claypool Johnson published in Boston in the 1830s. It's kind of like the first Mad Magazine kind of thing, satirical cartoons of the day. He's basically saying that a lot of people at the time wanted their doctor to subscribe to the same religion that they did. That's less and less the case now as we have a much more polyglot and polyreligious country. But anyway, and there's another cartoon from Scraps. I mean, the dialogue in these things is pretty tedious. So basically, what the physician attending the very ill patient is saying is that Dr. Trueskill, Dickens didn't come up with these names that say something about the character. He's not of the right religion, so he's out riding around his gig, his horse and wagon, to make house calls. But rather, you should attend to the doctor who doesn't have any ability as a medical man, but he's your same religion, is what they're saying here. Anyway, so the basic thing about the past is they had theories about what caused disease, what caused the body to work and not work, but very little understanding of what was going on with diseases. they knew some anatomy because they did do dissections. They've dissected animals and people for centuries. There was still, in the 19th century, a brisk business going in grave robbing to get enough cadavers for all the doctors to be wannabes to study anatomy by dissecting corpses. The people that robbed graves were often called resurrectionists, with a little tongue-in-cheek there. Certainly there just weren't enough criminals being executed in this country to provide all the well, no, I'm serious. I mean, you only had executions here in Massachusetts and county seats, and Worcester didn't hang anybody in this county between 1825 and 1845. So you didn't have a bumper crop of cadavers, which brings me to some stories, but they're probably a little indelicate for the audience. We'll talk in small groups later. Anyway, but to move ahead. Whoops, I'm leaning on something I'm not supposed to. Sorry. Trying to stay out of traffic here. Anyhow, the reality is that we know now death is inevitable, but we very much today in the 21st century live in a society that denies death. It doesn't happen. In the 19th century and before, death usually happened at home. The person was buried out of the home they lived in. Family and neighbors washed the body, dressed the body, prepared it for burial, and someone sat up with the body from the moment of death until the body was consigned to the grave. Today, people die in hospitals, and everything is done for us. It's very much removed. A lot of people get away from even open coffin ceremonies anymore, and there's just a video playing happy pictures. Not saying good or bad, just saying I think our culture today denies death. But for most of the past, it was so omnipresent that it was not something that could be easily avoided or denied, because people died at every age. Nowadays, most of the time, we die after a long life. In the past, and sometimes, of course, that's not the case, and it's a great shock and tragedy to us. But you had just about as much chance of dying at 8 years old as 80 years old in the past. If you look if you took ages in decades, right, and did a bar of how many people die from 1 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, those bars are pretty short nowadays until you get into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the bars get longer. Then the bars are just about the same length at every age. So you have as much chance of dying as an adolescent as you do as middle-aged. Not the case anymore. 1 in 8 children did not even see their first birthday. When you were born, you had a 1 in 5 chance of making it into your 60s. So some people live to be over 100, but the odds are that you wouldn't. Anyhow, but death was something you could not avoid. And so death and illness were something that were terrible, certainly not desired, but they were not unusual. They were kind of there, and you hoped for cures, but you didn't have an expectation of a cure. Most of us now, especially before we get to our 50s or 60s, kind of expect that if something goes wrong, a doctor can fix it. If I break something, if I get in an accident, they'll put in titanium, they'll do something. They'll replace joints as they wear out, they'll give us new heart valves, whatever. There's a lot of things that medical science can do now, and a lot of us think that almost anything can be fixed. But back then, you'd hope for a cure, but you didn't have a lot of faith in one or expectation of one. Of course, you also then did not have the huge healthcare industry that we have today. It was not even a significant fraction of the gross national product. It wasn't really an industry. There are certain doctors and pharmacists and such around, but it wasn't the huge industry that it has become today, for good and bad. But anyhow, so as I said, illness was rarely a surprise because people got sick all the time, and most health care was done at home, which was just normal. hospitals were basically places where people who did not have anybody to care for them went. And up until the 1800s, hospitals were basically places to go to die. That's what they were for, to keep people that were dying that did not have families somewhere to do it. By the 19th century, you're starting to have more charitable hospitals, like the Massachusetts General Hospital there in Boston, established in 1811. And increasingly, by the 1820s, 30s, even the teens, it's starting to become a place that is experimenting and trying to lead the way in medical understanding and discovery and education. But hospitals are basically not where you go when you need serious medical care. It's where you go when you can't get care at home, when you don't have family or means. But like I said, by the Massachusetts General Hospital, as the century progressed, was increasingly a teaching hospital, as it remains today, and especially for Harvard Medical School. This is a rare photograph, or early photograph, 1847. I mean, photography was only invented in 1839, of an anesthesia demonstration in Harvard Medical School in Mass General. Anyway, another thing, besides, we'll talk more about physicians, but there were nurses at the time. I mean, there's over 3 million nurses in the United States today, and there were nurses then who made their living. If you got a Boston directory, you could look up nurses. They're basically women who would care for you for pay if you didn't have a family member, a sister, an aunt, a mother, a cousin, a wife who would do it for you. But they didn't have real training, at least not in this country. The Germans were starting to train nurses, but basically what they're training them in is keeping the patient fed and keeping the patient comfortable, and basically just being someone like, your mother when you're sick, who can attend to you. Of course, the world came in this. I'm going to try to find the right button, not push the bad button. Here we go. This lady here is this lady here in the picture. This is Florence Nightingale, who was a British minor aristocrat who in 1853 at the Crimean War really made a name for herself, organizing a nursing corps to take care of wounded British soldiers and sick British soldiers, since 19th century armies and armies before that had a lot more trouble with disease than they had with wounds. But it was only the Germans who were even training nurses, and then it wasn't a medical training. It was more like how to just basically take care of somebody who's bedridden. Anyway, so it's supportive care. Keep the patient clean, keep him or her dry, comfortable, rested, keep them fed. What today we would call it is hydration and nutrition, but that's difficult to do. A lot of the deaths that occurred to people from infectious diseases, even if you get an infectious disease now that you probably have been vaccinated for and won't get, a lot of times, even if you get it, even if they don't have anything that can cure it, your system can cure it because they'll give you now intravenous fluids to keep you from getting dehydrated and dying. A lot of diseases, you just plain had diarrhea so much, or vomited so much, or sweat so much and couldn't keep anything down that your body just dried up and died.
Horrible.
Pardon?
Horrible.
Yes. Yeah, this is not a pretty lecture. My apologies to everybody. But anyway, so an awful lot of remedies, I would argue most remedies that you would experience were home remedies. That there was a commercial on television a few years ago called Dr. Mom, where, who knows how to buy the right cough medicine, was what I think they were trying to do with Dr. Mom on television. But anyway, there was an awful lot by the 1800s of advice literature. The 1800s was really had a huge rise in advice literature, what's called prescriptive literature, stuff to tell you how to do whatever, write letters, fill out forms, what have you, raise children, but including how to take care of people that are unwell. The Family Nurse, written by Lydia Maria Child, also wrote The American Frugal Housewife, The Mother's Book. She wrote a whole book on how to raise children. She never had children. Had no medical training, but these were bestsellers. Big surprise there. But anyway, and so that was most of the care that you got, because you didn't run off when you got ill. You were at home, and that's where you were cared for. Here's some of the things that Mrs. Child and others at the day recommended. Castor oil. I mean, sure, some of you are of an age where you can remember. I've seen reactions in the crowd to probably a grandmother forcing you to drink this. For those of you who don't know what castor oil is, it's an oil from a bean, the castor bean, and it's a laxative. Keeping your system moving, keeping everything going, is for in a lot of people's philosophy is a big part of health. Pardon me? Miralax is a different kind of laxative. There's a whole lot of ways to keep your insides moving. What Miralax does is draws water into your colon to get things going.
The best way
The
is
oil.
to eat fiber. That's the best way.
Yes, that's probably a good way.
No one has to know.
There's a whole lot of different laxatives that work a whole lot of different ways, and some of these advice books, a quarter of them are just all these different things that can get your guts going to keep it simple. Anyway, anyhow, we'll move on from that. She has another one here for slippery. Whoopsie, wrong button. At least it wasn't a bad button. Slippery elm, or red elm. A decoction. They use teas and decoctions a lot. A tea is you take something and you pour hot water over it, let it sit for a while, then drink it. A decoction is you boil the heck out of it for a few hours, and then you strain it and drink it. So you get a lot more of whatever you're cooking with a decoction than a tea. But anyway, they're taking slippery elm bark and drinking it, and it basically helps. It breaks up mucus, is what she's saying. And it's also good for hemorrhoids and diarrhea and tuberculosis, she's saying. They have no idea what's going on, is what I'm trying to show you with this. No, I mean, you know, there's in the healing wash for chilblains eruptions, basically skin conditions. You know, it dices, it slices, it makes julienne French fries, it does everything. You know, if you have hysteric fainting fits, the odor of burning feathers, horn or leather. Okay, I mean,
If you were mental, they just put you in the cuckoo house.
well, this isn't so much mental illness as just fainting fits. When you get all worked up, I wouldn't.
No one got worked up in those days because they're too busy working hard on the farm.
Well, I don't think that's the case, because they certainly in 1835 built the Worcester State Hospital.
That wasn't built till 1874, I heard.
That was built in 1835. It was built in Worcester because the state wanted to build one, and Worcester volunteered the land, and the state couldn't pass up that free deal. Anyhow, moving on from this, we don't have to give you every. You know, again, the whole we could spend months just talking about all these treatments and cures. And a lot of things are not written down. If you read these advice books, a lot of them are not written down. Even if we go back to Mrs. Child here, none of it says it cures anything. It's a treatment. You know, it might be good, but it doesn't. A lot of them don't cure anything, but it's what you use. You try something. I mean, I'm a registered nurse, and one of the things we're taught to do is when you take a health history of a patient, you ask them, you know, what's wrong with them and describe their signs and symptoms, but you say, what have you tried? What makes you feel better? What works? And so if you think it works, if it might work, if it might be soothing, good for you. You know, a lot of times, you know, have you tried a heating pad? Have you tried ice packs? Sometimes they work. Anyway, so common medicines, oils, herbs, and roots. There's a lot of different things, but a lot of what they're trying to do is try to get you going one way or another, like I was saying before. You've got purgatives, cathartics, in other words, things that get you going. Emetics, things that make you vomit, get you going the other way. Tonics, which restore you, stir you up, you know, stimulate you, get the blood going. Abortifacients, in other words, poisonous herbs that will, what they would say would cure blocked menses. In other words, probably cause a chemical abortion. and refrigerants, things that would cool the body as opposed to things like the tonics that would heat the body. Things to promote perspiration, even some painkillers, but not many. Not many analgesics. Not many at all. In fact, they know about opium, and there's various forms of opium they have. There's paregoric, which is camphorated tincture of opium, opium and alcohol. Tincture of opium, which is laudanum. Opium is mostly, anybody who's ever taken an opioid, now we use it mostly for pain. Anybody want to volunteer what taking like codeine or hydromorphone or any other opiates will do to your insides? It'll bind you up, right? Because it interferes with smooth muscle action. That's what they mostly used it for. If your insides are all churned, if you had cramps and diarrhea, a lot of times a little opium, they would give it to you not to relieve pain, but to just bind you up and to stop the cramps and agitation. Anyhow. But most of the books don't say anything about stopping pain with it. It'll make you sleepy, they say, and it'll take care of agitated insides, to use the vernacular. They had a lot of what they called patent medicines. They're not patented with the government. They're not registering the formula like medical patents are now. They just use that name to sell them. That means that their name, here's a regional one, Phelps Arcanum from Worcester, very popular 19th century cure-all. It's always secret formulas. There's no ingredients on the label, but it's a matter of faith. There's no Food and Drug Administration yet. They have a lot of elixirs of life. That's a real common one. Revitalizer for body and mind. A lot of them have alcohol in it. Some have opiates in it. Some have cayenne pepper in it. All sorts of stuff just to give a reaction. That's the thing with the medicines, is you know it's a medicine, you know it's working because something happens. I'm serious. I'm serious. I'll get into that a little more later. But here's some pictures from the Old Sturbridge Village collection of different bottles we have. We have a huge glass collection. The people who founded Old Sturbridge Village made spectacles, eyeglasses for a living, and so they were fascinated by glass. So these are medicine bottles. Sarsaparilla. Sarsaparilla is a drink, or excuse me, it's a tropical vine. There's a couple different species of sarsaparilla, and beverages made with sarsaparilla are used to treat a number of maladies, including venereal complaints. And essence of life, more of those patent medicines. Who knows what's in it? Vegetable home syrup. If it has vegetable in it, it means it's probably going to get you going. Vegetable pills. The number one complaint at Massachusetts General Hospital in the early 1800s was dyspepsia. In other words, my insides don't feel right. I've got heartburn, I'm constipated, or I've got basically your insides are a mess. It's because Americans ate too much rich food, and ate too fast. I know you're shocked by that. And Dr. Hotstetter's stomach bitters. We not beat this to death. But anyway, they also used a lot of toxic chemicals. Any of you watching the miniseries Victoria on PBS and Masterpiece Theater? Many, I see people nodding. Did you notice that when her brother-in-law, Prince Ernst, Albert's brother, that the valet went in and found little packets of this stuff, calomel, in his clothes? They were using that to treat his, a condition he caught with some of the court ladies. What it is mercury chloride. There's the chemical symbol for it, formula for it if you want to know. This is the stuff in its native state. This is how some of the bottles were at the time. It's because mercury, of course, is a neurotoxin. That's another way to get your insides going, is to stimulate the nerves, some more gently than others. But a neurotoxin, something that will kill you if you take too much of it, will do that. They used it to treat almost anything and everything. That's the thing about a lot of these cures, is they use them to treat almost anything or anything. And if you're desperate and don't know what's causing it, okay, if that's what an expert says would fix it. And you're wondering why this poor fellow is so deformed. That's because That's because it is a poison, and besides the nervous system, it can attack bones. A real common side effect of calomel is to have all your teeth fall out, or for your big portions of your jaw to die. Phosphorus did the same thing. A lot of people who manufactured matches in the 19th century got a disease called phossy jaw, and part of their jaw would fall out or atrophy. So that's an unfortunate side effect of this very powerful and very widely used medicine. Lest we think that we're so much smarter than they are. I'm sure you watch television, and if you listen to all the disclaimers that the lawyers make the drug companies say, you know, you got these things that may cause death. Why would you take it? But they do. No, I mean, many of us are probably taking these things. These are all from, you know, modern. Here's Symbicort. You know, I got the side effects and everything here, and whoopsie. And you know, this is real stuff. Do not take it if you have heart problems, are pregnant, planning to get pregnant. Serious side effects include death, heart failure, and nausea. Well, nausea they put last, you know. You make an upset stomach if it doesn't kill you. But anyway, I mean, you know, medicines are not without risks. So anyway, so common side effects and serious side effects, and these things go on and on. You know, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, these life-threatening skin reactions, life-threatening allergic reactions, liver problems, including liver failure. You can't live without a liver, my friends. So, you know, why would you take this? But people do because they want relief from something. And cancer. A lot of times when I'm at Old Sturbridge Village talking about 19th century medicine, and people ask, and you know, one thing we'll get to is the whole idea of bleeding patients. That's not a shock to many of you who know anything about 19th century medicine and 18th century medicine. It was common for all sorts of maladies to open a vein and take out some blood. Now, there are reasons to do that. One way to treat a disease called hematochromia, which is too much iron in the blood today, is to regularly donate blood to the Red Cross or go to your doctor's office and they'll take out some blood. Honest to goodness, this is 21st century medicine. There's medicines they can take too, but a common treatment if you've got hematochromia is every few months go to Red Cross, do a good thing, give your blood. And it keeps the iron levels down and is very therapeutic. But a lot of times when people will like, oh, you know, they were such crude, and they were crude. But think about it today. You think in 100 years, people aren't going to laugh at us for treating cancer with radiation and chemotherapy? I'm not talking against radiation or chemotherapy. If your doctor wants you to have it and you have cancer, do whatever your doctor tells you and you think is best. But what causes cancer? Radiation and strong chemicals. So, you know, I hope in 100 years people will be laughing at us saying, oh my gosh, what barbarians. So I don't mean to insult anyone who's has cancer, knows somebody with cancer, or is a physician or a nurse that treats people with these chemicals to make them better. God love you. But I hope that in less than 100 years, this will seem barbaric. I'm just trying to give it for perspective. So forgive me, mea culpa. Doctors, the old-time doctor. Remember in the cartoon that was making fun of the gig riding doctor? Doctors almost always had a horse and a chaise, a little two-wheeled cart to get around, because doctors then had to make house calls. So you called for the doctor, but only when there was no more alternatives, when you were really sick. It wasn't, I've got a blister on my finger, I don't know, doctor, what should... No. It was like when you're in bed sick, they've done what they could for you with your family, and it looks like you might well die. And then they call a doctor. And because you're too sick to go to a doctor, the doctor almost has to come to you. You think about it, nowadays people can be bundled in a car, put in an ambulance, put on a helicopter, and get to medical care. But then, with poor roads, with only one horse for every 10 people, the last thing a very sick person on death's door needs to be done is bundled up and brought somewhere, hoping the doctor will be in. So what you do is you send someone for the doctor, and he, almost always he, sometimes she, comes to you. So that's a bit different than today. Most doctors worked, for their headquarters, worked out of their homes. Some did have freestanding offices that they'd keep their medicines in and have a little waiting room maybe when they weren't there. But mostly it was house calls, and like I said, it was a matter of necessity that a doctor made a house call. and brought medicines with him rather than send you off somewhere to a pharmacist or send someone to the CVS to get it. Which leads to, how much did it cost? I mean, that's a common thing we still think about. Most doctors charge per visit. Luckily for us, as for those of you who have heard me talk about the economy of the past before, or know about it from other sources, know that early America was a very cash-poor society. There just wasn't a lot of hold-in-your-hand money around, so people, as a result, kept track of things in dollars and cents terms, but not in hold-in-your-hand dollars and cents a lot of the time. And so they wrote down that you owed the doctor 50 cents or $1 for a house call and so much for the medicine he left. And they wrote it down as debts and credits. And luckily for we historians, a lot of these record books and individual papers and bills survive, so we can know not only how much it cost, but how often doctors made house calls per day and how far they ranged, if you then look at a map of who they're visiting, and so forth and so on. But to give you an idea of the 50 cent to $1, and sometimes they're up to $3, if you were a lady working in a textile factory for 6 hours a day, it would take you 6 days to make $2. So doctors made pretty good money. Big shock. That's so they could afford fancy vehicles like that they know that they needed for their business. And doctors, being prosperous men, often would have their pictures painted, and we can know something about them. When you had your portrait done in the 18th or 19th century, it wasn't just to record what you looked like, but also to record who you were. This is Dr., as you can see, Jesse Kitteridge Smith of Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. And you can see his tools of the trade there. He has lancet and scalpel and various and sundry medicine bottles and funnels and other things next to him. He's got a medicine bottle in his hand. And parked outside, you might be able to discern, is his chaise, all ready to go for a house call. And a very nice house it is. So he's trying to show that he's prosperous, well-dressed. And the self-portrait of Dr. Metcalf Marsh of Smithfield, Rhode Island, he's trying to show, I think, by his dress and his confident gaze, I should say, that he's professional. At least that's, I think he's a professional-looking fellow. This is the respected Dr. John Brewster and his wife, painted by the deaf-mute artist John Brewster, their son. And so he's a respected member of society, maybe writing a prescription here. You ever wonder why that RX, it's a abbreviation of Latin for take thou. That's why they put RX for prescriptions. Anyhow, Dr. Gary Hinman, a miner of Litchfield, Connecticut. Increasingly, he's trying to show he's educated. Look at all the books. He's trying to show education. That's increasingly a hallmark of a doctor, is to show education. Anyhow, what they did was called remedial, or practical medicine. There's no germ theory. They don't understand viruses and bacteria and how that causes illness or wellness for the good bacteria. So there's little understanding of how bodies works. They don't really know how hormones and neurotransmitters and all the other things that medical science knows about today work. They don't know much about biochemistry. They just kind of can cut up cadavers and say, okay, we've got a heart and lungs and this and that, and they got a vague idea of macro physiology, but not much beyond that. You know, they figure out that veins and arteries, and they haven't even figured that out for very long. Most doctors were still basing their general theory of medicine. There's a lot of theories of medicine around in the 17 and 1800s, but most of them are still, up until the second half of the 1800s, are based on what's called Galenic medicine. This is Galen, or a bust of him. He was a Greek physician practicing in Rome in the, well, here's his dates, 121 to 216 AD. So long, long time ago. His basic theory was that the body is made up of the four humors. Anybody ever take Shakespeare like as a course and have to read? Did your Shakespeare teacher tell you about the four humors? Mine did. That's how I was first exposed to the four humors, because they're always talking about, oh, he's got a choleric personality, or he's got a sanguine personality. The four humors: blood, yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile, control the body. And, you know, they have certain characteristics of dry, hot, cold. And so when any of these get out of balance, too much or too little of any one of them, that's when you get sick. And so trying to keep everything balanced is the aim, which is why they let blood. Is you take some blood out of them, you get them to vomit, you get them to go the other way, you get them to sweat, you're getting the humors in balance. That's what all that's about, is to balance the humors. And one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence was the father of what was called heroic medicine. That if a little bit of vomiting is good, a lot of vomiting is better. If a little bit of bloodletting is good, a lot of bloodletting is better. Well, you wouldn't have to go to a doctor, doctors won't do this to you today, so don't worry about that. But anyway, but basically what doctors and Dr. Mom, you know, if she was getting a little more aggressive, would do to you if you're not feeling well is these four things: bleed, blister, vomit, and purge. And like I said, Dr. Rush figured more is better. I mean, people know that things work when there's a side effect. Okay, 21st century medicine. And again, I'm not advocating anything here. I'm just giving a perspective. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, you know, mood balancers. There are scientific articles that claim that there are studies that their chemical effect on the body in terms of balancing mood is minimal, but because they've got severe side effects, people feel they work, and so they work. In other words, there's studies that show they're more of a placebo effect, a psychosomatic effect, than a chemical effect. Again, if you're taking them on prescription, keep taking them. Don't listen to me. I'm not your doctor. But the point is, if people don't feel side effects, they worry that it's not working. But if they got the severe side effects, they know, oh, it must be doing the thing. It must be doing something. Again, which is basically tied to, I'm trying to make some parallels between now and then to make you see it's not a completely different world. But anyway, Dr. Benjamin Rush was that more is better theory. Of course, that more is better is what's killed George Washington, but we don't have to go there. He wasn't Washington's doctor. He knew Washington, but he didn't attend him in his final illness. So sweating, purging, puking, bleeding, anemetics. As you can see, this poor fellow's not feeling well, and the doctor's getting ready, so when ready for him to vomit in the bowl. And this poor aristocratic lady with her maid there is ready to get an enema. There's that's an enema. Didn't come in a plastic bottle like it does now. Anyway, and this guy is just a man. I don't want to. Stop looking. Good gosh. Anyway, cupping something that you might not have thought of. Again, you got to get the fluids in balance. One other way to redistribute blood and serous fluid. Serous fluid is the clear stuff that comes out if you got a cut or a blister, you got a burn. There's clear liquid in it. That's called serous fluid. Is to take hot glasses, cups like this, put them on the skin, and as they cool, they create a vacuum and suck fluid and skin into them, and you get these blisters. So raising blisters, you can do it this way. You can do it with caustic agents that will basically produce burns, and we know that a partial thickness burn, what they used to call a second-degree burn, one symbol of that is blisters. And this thing here is a scarificator, a whole bunch of spring-loaded little blades that would, it doesn't go deep, just a little bit, just below the skin to take out these fluids. Okay, you want it gross? We're doing a little gross. That's all. And that's the idea with leeches. That's the idea with leeches, is that leeches, are an organism that sucks blood. They have a sharp lancet-like tongue. And their saliva, their tongue is coated with a substance that basically keeps your blood from coagulating, so it can flow. Mosquitoes do the same thing on a much smaller style. They're not going to take enough blood to really do much therapeutic thing, and then you'll itch afterwards. A leech bite doesn't itch, so it's good. Anyhow, but so a lot of times doctors would keep leeches and use those to, more gently than opening a vein, remove a little blood. Leeches still are used therapeutically now in medicine now and then. I mean, there's sterile, special farm-raised leeches, only used once. They don't go to a pond and get them anymore. But there's a lot of studies that show they're effective in getting excess blood out of wounds and bruises and that kind of thing. So it's not all over the place used, but it's still used in the 21st century fairly commonly, and it's accepted. Actually, they use maggots, fly larvae, purified ones, for debriding wounds as well, sometimes nowadays. So again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. They're not completely nuts back then. They mean well. The thing is about the medicines is there's no regulation. One of the best things that came out of Theodore Roosevelt's administration was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which started the road of having things that won't kill you when you're trying to get better, or less likely to kill you when you're trying to get better, but making sure that things are more efficacious. And now you can't get medicines as medicines unless they're proven and approved by the government as not just not hurting you, but even having some therapeutic helpful effect. Sorry, I keep knocking the screen. But these are just some of the things that you could find in the past that are not guaranteed to be safe or effective, as things have to be now. You'll notice that this one, whoopsie, sorry, cannabis indica, that cannabis is a marijuana plant. So, you have medical marijuana now. You had medical marijuana in the past. Of course, cocaine tooth drops. That would help with a toothache. Yeah, this is a later 19th, maybe even early 20th century ads. But anyhow, we won't have to beat this to death. We've got all night. So as far as surgery goes, surgery then and surgery now, it's still cutting into the body, but then without anesthesia and without aseptic technique, much less sterile technique, the idea of surgery was to do it and do it real quick before the patient died of shock. I'm serious. I mean, major surgery had to be done very quick. So the skill of a doctor was not just being able to do it, but do it very, very, very quickly. And a lot of times they did not have antibiotics. If you had a serious injury to an extremity, an arm or a leg or a foot or a hand, the best chance you had of that not killing you by getting infected and going gangrenous and giving you blood poisoning was to amputate it and hope that you had a clean wound that could be more easily kept clean and heal. But the doctor had, at best, a minute and a half to do it all. And you had to have people holding the patient because he's not just going to sit there because he's conscious. There's jokes in the old movies about, you give them a lot of liquor. You don't see anybody telling you to do that then. You think about it. What does alcohol do? It makes the person combative. Last thing you want to do is start hurting a drunk. And on top of that, it's going to make him bleed more. So, I'm sure some people did, but it wasn't a common, first thing, get them drunk like in the Western movies. No, not so much. But anyway, so speed was of the essence. And it was a common treatment for any kind of injury, a severe injury to an extremity. So there are a lot of different flavors of doctors at the time. Most were what we would think of as orthodox doctors, the physician, the trained doctor of the day. How were they trained? Most of them would not be trained in the English system of having the Royal Society of Medicine and higher learning, and we didn't have the distinction that the British put even today between physicians and surgeons. Surgeon being a lower form of physician because they're more akin to butchers. They work with their hands, and the physician more works with his head and treats it with medicines. But the American Revolution kind of delegitimized the British model. So most people, right into the, well into the 1800s, learned to be a doctor the same way you learned to be a blacksmith or learned to be a carpenter or learned to be a farmer, is you worked with somebody that was doing that. You apprenticed. And observed, watched, listened, helped, and got your skills on the job as a trainee. That's how most people learned. The Massachusetts Medical Society, founded in 1781, was a professional organization. One of the hallmarks of a profession is that they organize themselves. And the Medical Society issued licenses, not the state. That was something doctors really fought, because for a long time they did not want the state regulating who could be a doctor, because you might not be the doctor that had the philosophy that the state decided to license, because there were different philosophies of medicine. There was a lot of minor points of different philosophies of medicine, and so they didn't want the state regulating that. And so for a long time the doctors fought regulation. There was an attempt at state licensing. I have in the small print here on the bottom between 1819 and 1835. But the doctors were effective in keeping that out, because they didn't want to be the ones that couldn't practice. Anyway, medical schools were increasingly another way of learning to be a doctor, but they were far from common until well into the 19th century. You don't even, Harvard Medical School is the third oldest, but that doesn't come along until 1782. A few others come along, Dartmouth 1798, Yale 1810, and then by 1840 there's 26 more. But a lot of them are not university affiliated. Throughout the 19th century, up till the early 20th century, most medical schools where a few doctors got together and opened a medical school and offered degrees, offered certificates in medicine. That was the common way. That was much more common than the ones associated with the university. Anyway, so it was standard or allopathic medicine, basically treating injuries with tools and medicines. Just a few of the tools. There's lots of tools. We could play this game all night too. This is a symbol of an Orthodox doctor. These are forceps for delivering a difficult baby, a baby that's not presenting normally, and it's going to be a difficult birth. That was one thing that set a physician apart from midwives who delivered a lot of babies, was the doctor had the forceps. He was going to go in there with these iron fingers. They would be wrapped in leather if they're going to be used. It wouldn't be just iron on the baby's head to help with a difficult birth. This contraption here is a phleem, what they would use for opening a vein, usually an antecubital vein, where we give blood now, for blood work and donations. That just pokes a little hole along the vein. The blade would be going up and down your arm. You wouldn't try to sever the vein in half. You'd poke a hole in it, by the way, in case you're worried about a phleem. Don't try to bleed yourself, but if you ever try to. And this thing here is a rarity. This thing here is rare until the 1860s, when they get much more common. They have in the 18-teens on. Anybody know what this is? This is a stethoscope, a monaural stethoscope. This is turned out of wood. I was in Eastern Europe 20 years ago in Romania, and the doctors were using stethoscopes that looked just like this, except they were made out of red plastic. They didn't have the stethoscopes in your ears. Do some people remember that from other travels? Yeah. Anyway, but stethoscopes were not very common until the later half of the 19th century. They'd feel your pulse, but they wouldn't listen to your heart so much. Again, all kinds of medicines. And because a lot of injuries had to be treated with amputation, most doctors would have a surgical kit with the basics, a tourniquet and some saws and forceps, again, to get it over with quickly. Anyhow, and this one, I think this is a trephine. This is the one that always people like. It's basically like a hole saw. If you have a subdural hematoma, in other words, a accumulation of blood in your head that's pressing on your brain and may kill you, the way they'll relieve it now is usually open up a little flap in your skull, but then they would drill a hole and make a hole in your skull and let the blood come out so that it didn't kill your brain with the pressure. It's not pretty, but if it keeps you from dying, it's better that. Anyway, I didn't have time to do a lot of research about Shrewsbury Physicians. I apologize. But just to give you an idea, in these country towns, we'll use Sturbridge as an example. In 1838, pick a year in the early 19th century, that's the year I picked, for a town of about 2,000 people, there were 5 practicing doctors. There was 1 lawyer in the town at the time, and there were 3 ministers, the other professions. In the early 19th century, there are only 3 professions: law, divinity, and medicine. You know, nowadays, anybody who gets paid for something is a professional. You play basketball, you are a janitor. If you get paid for it, you're a professional. Then a professional was considered as somebody who works with his head, not his hands. And the 3 were lawyers, doctors, and ministers. And doctors were the most plentiful of those 3. Of the 5 in the town of Sturbridge, for most of these details, you don't need to read this stuff. It doesn't really matter. You had they had different things after their names. You got Abijah Howard and the recently deceased Jacob Corey, died in 1837. Jacob Corey Sr., he's number 6. Both have MMS after their names. Anybody want to guess what that means? Is Massachusetts Medical Society. Exactly. I was wondering if somebody might think it's actually a degree that physician assistants get now, or can get. It's a Master of Medical Science. Physician assistants are sometimes wear that academic. But no, they're members of the Massachusetts Medical Society. The MDs there, Calvin Park Fisk and William Saunders, are medical doctors. And Jacob Corey Jr. and Daniel Mason don't have anything after their names. The difference is primarily if you look at their ages. The oldest men are members of the Massachusetts Medical Society. The youngest men are medical doctors. They have an MD degree. They have gone to some medical school. May or may not be college. We know that Calvin Park Fisk went to Brown, but they went to some kind of medical school, and that's where they got their certificate to be called medical doctors. Daniel Mason and Jacob Corey Jr. apprenticed, and you'll notice that they're in an age between the oldest ones with the MMS after their names and the youngest ones with MD after their names. And so I think it's a generational shift. I won't beat that to death. I'm getting over analyzing. So anyway, you got about 1 doctor in these country towns for about every 400 to 500 people. The United States today has technically 1 doctor for every 325 people, but 1 direct care doctor for every 480 people. So it's about the same as then. But a lot of doctors today, most doctors today, are specialists. Some don't even treat people. They're researchers. And so for primary care physicians, your family doctor, your doctor, there's 1 for every 1,500 plus people in America today. Doctors, because they are not making house calls very much, can see more patients, make better use of their time. Anyhow, this is a little more about medical training. Some of these photographs here are the later 19th century. It was common later in the 19th century, if you were in medical school, you and your buddies who were in the same dissection group together would often have your picture taken with your dissection subject. They're rather gruesome, but they often put these little aphorisms, little sayings under the table. We have shuffled off his mortal coil. I've got another one here. She lived for others, but she died for us. Yeah, did we get that one? Anyway, so they studied the what of medicine more than the how. They're trying to find all the bones and the muscles and the nerves and the major blood vessels. So the best medical training you could get was still in Europe, usually Germany or Scotland. But like I said, Massachusetts General and other universities in this country were also starting to get more into it. In the second half of the 1800s, especially the 1860s on, medicine starts getting a lot more scientific. They start using the idea of theories and then experiments to prove or disprove theories. You know, what we know as scientific research in medicine, instead of just here, try this, it'll cure everything. They're starting to use microscopes and understand how germ theory. They're starting to use anesthesia, which I'll talk more about in a minute. They're starting to use more antiseptic and aseptic techniques. And there's more and more public health. An awful lot of disease wasn't so much cured by doctors, it was cured by sewers. By basically having better sanitation and better nutrition. You know, when people die in famines, most of them are not starving to death. They're weakened by hunger, and then diseases can swoop in on their weakened constitutions and kill them. So most people who died, for example, in the Irish potato famine in the mid-1800s died of diseases rather than hunger per se, because they were weakened by lack of nutrition. There's another cartoon from some scraps. There were alternative medicines then, just as they are now, and they were called quacks then, main as some would call them now. But there's many, many forms. I'm not going to give one of the popular treatments in vogue besides the allopathic doctors of the day was called the water cure. All methods of using water for better health. Cold water baths, hot water baths, steam baths, inhaling steam, going to mineral spas and bathing in water that stank of sulfur or was very salty, or going to the ocean or drinking seawater, all kind of water cures. Again, if you were sick and you hoped it would help, or you thought it helped, or it helped your Aunt Matilda, and she said you should try it, you go for a cure. Some of them, people thought it was funny. Why would you sit in a tub of cold water if you had a fever? Well, it might cool you down, but also it might make you feel miserable and hurt you. They're also selling mineral waters, including from around here. You can see the Quabog spring water there in the middle. But many different ways of using water. Electricity was another common way of treating illnesses, and a lot of times your orthodox physician, if one thing or another did not work, would try something else. And that's true still today, or at least in the recent past. Not that you need to know, but when I was 15, I ruptured the tibia tendon in my right leg. In other words, what lets me do that wouldn't let me do it. The quadriceps, the muscles here, no longer connected across my knee to the tibia on my shin. And so my leg was just flopping. And the point is, the surgeon who fixed it, so I can do this today and impress you, also was an acupuncturist. He never used acupuncture on me, but, you know, he also did that. Anyhow, nonetheless, the point is that there's a lot of different ways. And a lot of standard physicians, if something else didn't work, would try electricity. A lot of the early electricity was static electricity. You know, you rub the balloon on the carpet and your hair stands up on end, or you get a little shock when you scuffle across this carpet and touch a metal doorknob. Zzz, static electricity. In the 1700s, there were a lot of people would go around and entertain you by showing you all the wonders of static electricity. But people also would start curing all sorts of diseases. And there was a fellow that wrote a book in 1802 that said that you could treat anything with electricity and probably cure it except for cataracts. And he knew because he tried, and in his book went on for about a chapter, how he tried to treat patients with cataracts for electricity, but it didn't work. But it cured everything else: paralysis, hemorrhoids, skin complaints, impotence, all kinds of things were cured with electricity. And then by the 1830s and 40s, they figure out spinning a coil of wires inside a magnet produces a lot more electricity. That's how the electricity that we're enjoying right now is generated somewhere in a turbine. But anyhow, and that more powerful electricity was used to treat. The electricity was not just give you a shock. A lot of times they would insulate you. They'd put you on a chair. Anyway, I'm going to go back to this one. They'd put you on a chair with glass legs and have you hold electrodes and then deliver the charge. And because you're insulated, you don't feel a thing. But they knew electricity had something to do with life. You know, take a dead frog's legs, give it a shot of electricity, they jump. They knew it had something to do with life. And so they used it as to restore these unseen, unknown substances and forces that keep us alive somehow. And that was the idea behind electrical medicine. So sometimes the shock was used, and sometimes just giving a dose of electricity without feeling a shock was used. Anyhow, not to beat that to death. This, Thomas Gale was the one who wrote the book about electricity. The book, Electricity or the Ethereal Fire Considered. Dr. Gale is from Troy, New York. He basically made his living going around the country, treating people with electricity, and selling these little machines that he made, and selling his book. This little machine was owned by Dr. Samuel Parks Knight of Dudley, Massachusetts, who used it there for the better part of his 50-year practice in Dudley, Massachusetts. He was a normal doctor who would bleed you and purge you and puke you and blister you and give you calomel and other substances. But if that didn't work and you wanted to try, he had this little thing set up to give you static electric charges. This thing here, I'm not going to get into the whole machine, but this thing here is just a standard glass bottle with some metal foil around it. It's a really, really, really primitive capacitor to build up an electric charge. This is your glass cylinder, which through a band, which you can't see, connects to this, which would be tied to a crank, as you can see by the hole worn in the wallpaper, to spin this around against a pad that would make an static electric charge, hold it in the capacitor until it built up, and then the electrodes either jolt the patient with a little bit of a jolt, or if they're insulated, just lets the ethereal fire flow through them. Dr. Gale, in his book, goes on about all the different ways, the different places you place the electrodes for different conditions, and which ones you use the shock and which ones you just let the electricity flow through them, and how often you do it and how frequently you do it. And anyway, we still use electroshock convulsive therapy when certain mental conditions no longer or do not respond to drug treatment. It's still now they anesthetize you, by the way, if you do have that done, so you don't have to feel it. Anyhow, herbalists, there were a lot of empiricists, both people with training and folk healers that were basically herbalists. One of the most popular one was this fellow here, Samuel Thompson, who's a botanist, who wrote a book on botanical medicine, who basically would sell the book for $20 and give you a certificate, and you could be a Thompsonian physician yourself. But there were also native people that used herbs, and a lot of people turned to them. Indian doctors and doctresses, treating all sorts of maladies with herbs. There was homeopathy, treating like with like, but in teeny tiny doses. In other words, if you had a fever, the way to cure the fever is to give you some kind of herb or medicine that would cause a fever in a healthy person, but to give it to you in a teeny tiny itty bitty dose. So if you ever see old medical kits with these little bottles, with these tiny little pills that are about the size of a poppy seed, that's what it is. It's a homeopathic medical kit to give you the tiniest possible dose. Some of you might be able to see it in this picture. These teeny tiny little, they're not teeny tiny little pills because they're so powerful. It's to give you the smallest possible dose of what would cause it. Treat like with like. Treat fire with fire, if you will. And that was believed to be cured. There were people that advocated most of the illnesses were from too much drink, and America was a nation of drinkers, that's for sure. Alcohol consumption was about 3 times per capita what it is today. This lovely cartoon shows how at first you have a happy drink with friends, and then it gets worse, and then you party too much, and you lose your job, and you end up blowing your brains out in a drunken stupor because your life is over after robbing people. Anyway, this fellow here, Sylvester Graham, the father of bran bread and pumpkins, he was called. He is the one the graham crackers named after. He basically said that America's problems were caused by too much, excess of everything. And he said everything should be in moderation. St. Paul said that too. But he especially advocated a vegetable diet, no meat. Meat was too much stimulation. Back to the Galenic thing of you're overstimulated if things are out of balance. A lot of the feeling was that you're ill because some part of you is overstimulated, is acting too much, and that's tiring out your body. So if that overstimulation could be avoided, either by giving you something to counteract it or to have you not do whatever is making you overstimulated, would calm you down. And so Graham said you should not eat meat, you should not drink alcohol, you should eat only simple foods, vegetable-based foods, bread, but not sifted bread, nice coarse bran bread that's baked at home, not in a commercial bakery, by the loving hands of mother. You should only eat 3 times a day at 6, 12, and 6. You should chew your food slowly, never eat too much. Bless you. He died at 54. He wrote in his wife liked rich food and liked gin and other things, especially when she was pregnant. And he would buy her these things saying, "Mother says it must be so." And she lived like 20 years longer than he did. So the great irony of Sylvester Graham is that while most people would agree today that he preached a very healthful lifestyle, he claimed he got to be a bit egotistical because he was well received in some circles. He lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, most of his life. He claimed that when he died, his many followers would tear down his house and use its bricks to form a monument to his memory. If you go to Northampton, his house still stands. It is now a restaurant serving burgers and eggs and bacon. It's called Sylvester's. There's a picture of him in the lobby. So talk about cruel irony. Poor Sylvester.
They still use the fireplaces, wood burning fire.
No, they have modern kitchen in the back.
Well, I mean just for looking at, just for enjoying.
Nope.
Like the Wayside Inn.
Nope.
I like
Nope.
going that way.
Oh, the Wayside Inn is lovely. But no, Sylvester's is a perfectly nice restaurant. I've eaten there. Anyhow, but Sylvester Graham would not approve. Mrs. Graham might. But anyway, there are also a lot of people who were not doctors, did not call themselves doctors. Or there were also some physicians who called themselves doctors who practiced things that regular physicians, doctors, MDs, don't do anymore, like dentistry. An awful lot of doctors included dentistry as part of their practice. So dentists were not doctors, but doctors could be dentists. Does that make sense? I don't have to beat that to death. But anyhow, dentists were misters, not if they weren't a physician for something else. They weren't doctors yet. They were aspiring to. They formed a dental school in Baltimore in 1840. This is another cartoon from Scraps. It's a lot of stuff here, but it basically says, I'm going to pull your tooth, but you're sitting awful close to the chandelier. So, in case you go over backwards, I don't want you to kick it when you come around, so we're going to move you. And what he's got in his hand is this thing here called a tooth key. It's basically a hook and a pivot. You get that real good grip on a tooth. If you don't know what you're doing, you keep twisting it and break the person's tooth off at the jawline or break their jaw. What a trained dentist knows is you get this by turning, get a good grip on the tooth, and then use this lever on the other teeth as a fulcrum to rip the tooth out. But anyway, we don't have to beat dentistry to death. That could be a whole lecture on its own. But anyway, but the real money, there's a dentist's broadside from Chelsea, Vermont. So he'll do everything dentists are advertised now, cleaning, filling, insertion of artificial teeth. That's where the money was in dentures, by the way. Cleaning, filling, pulling teeth, yeah, that's all nice. They'll charge for it. But this artificial teeth, only the well-to-do could afford. These are both different dentures owned by George Washington, by the way. If you go to Mount Vernon did a wonder. If you haven't been there in 10 or 20 years, you should go. They've spent tens of millions, almost $100 million redoing it. And they have an entire room devoted just to George Washington's dental problems. And they have one pair of his dentures, I think it's actually this pair, in a vitrine in the middle, lit from underneath like it's the Hope Diamond or something. False teeth, anyway. None of his teeth were wooden, by the way. He had some that were human teeth. He had some that were carved bone, carved ivory, carved animal teeth, but some with gold plate, some with tin plate, all sorts of other appliances to hold it together. Of course, if you have upper and lowers, you need springs. They don't fit that tight, so you need springs to keep them in. A lot of times people in diaries would talk about having their teeth adjusted. That means you go to the dentist to either tighten or loosen the spring. In the famous dollar bill picture of Washington by Gilbert Stuart, you know, his jaw muscles are tight. Take out a dollar bill later and look at it. You can see his jaw muscles are tight because he's probably got his springs a little too tight. Because if the upper plate is loose, the springs are loose, they're just going to flop. They're too strong. You got to really work to keep your mouth shut. Otherwise, you go. And Washington going like this would look cool on the dollar bill. So he's trying to look dignified and keep his mouth shut. But anyway, no, that's a serious thing. So you had to take your teeth out to eat, though. They're for show. They're not for working. We won't beat artificial teeth to death. But not everybody, like I said, physicians sometimes included. Some people were dentists full-time. And they had people that did it part-time. This fellow here, from Ware, Massachusetts, Joseph Moore and his family. This is a picture from the MFA in Boston. It's a lovely picture by Erastus Salisbury Field from nearby Worcester. But Mr. Moore here, in the wintertime, stayed home in Ware and made hats. And in the summertime, he traveled around and took care of people's teeth. You know, cleaned them, pulled them, made dentures, was a full-service dentist. And apparently, between making hats and doing dentistry, he had a quite prosperous house and could afford a painter to paint the whole family. Anyhow, there's also people like bone setters, people that basically just try to put dislocations back together and to take broken bones that weren't compound fractures, in other words, that hadn't punctured the skin, but you definitely broken your leg or your arm, and tried to set the bone, put it in its right alignment, and then splint it so it could heal. Also, midwives were very common. Most women were delivered of midwives, not physicians. The physicians are in the 1800s are increasingly trying to get that business, especially for potentially difficult labors and deliveries, but midwives were still very, very common. Training for a midwife was basically you were a middle-aged woman who'd had children of your own and had helped deliver children. It was that on-the-job training. But anyhow, that was really common to be midwives as well. And you did have a lot of native healers with alternative medicine, both male and female, Indian doctors and doctresses, some specializing in things, this one here specializing in cancers, but a lot of people from Worcester, people specialize in digestive complaints, again, mostly treating with herbs and herbal remedies, but again, no germ theory. And so a lot of what they thought you had, we don't know what people had or died of. You know, they might say, oh, this is this, this is that, but all they've got really is the signs and symptoms to diagnose a disease with. There's no test they can give. They just say, well, it looks like that. Could be smallpox, could be measles. There we go. So pick one. You know, somebody grabs their chest and falls down. They go, oh, he had a heart attack. Might have had a stroke. You know, I mean, no. I mean, we don't know. They don't know. They could sometimes take a pretty good diagnosis, but they didn't have tests to know for sure. And there were very few cures. They had treatments for almost everything, but very few cures. And they're treating the symptoms, not the disease. Since they don't know what the disease is a lot of the time and don't know what causes it, for real, most all the time, what they do is they try to treat the symptoms. Sometimes homeopathically with the cure, excuse me, with what causes it, and sometimes with something to make you feel better, reduce a fever, warm you if you have chills. Anesthesia. I promised I'd talk about anesthesia. I know I've been rambling on a long time. I apologize. I'll let you go soon. Horace Wells on the left. There's two fathers of anesthesia, and ironically, they're both from southern New England, and ironically, they're both dentists. Even more ironically, William Morton from Charlton learned to be a dentist from Horace Wells. And they were in practice together. So Morton apprenticed to Wells. This is before either one of them discovered anesthesia. Horace Wells taught Morton to be a dentist. Horace Wells practiced in Hartford, Connecticut, and one night he went to be entertained. There was no Hartford Historical Society for them to go to, so he went to what was called a gas show. This traveling entertainer came around and would make nitrous oxide. And ever been to a hypnotist show or seen one on TV? You know, the guy comes up and he talks about hypnotism, and then he gets volunteers from the audience and he hypnotizes them and they cluck like a chicken or do something, you know, power suggestion. Well, that's what the gas man would do. He'd get a few volunteers, they'd take some nitrous oxide, they'd act silly, you know, they'd laugh. It's called laughing gas for a reason. They act silly, they do things, they're kind of stoned. Quite frankly, they're under the influence of an intoxicating substance. So Wells took his wife to a gas show one night in Hartford, and a friend of his, who happened to be a pharmacist, that doesn't really germane to the story, but he was one of the subjects. He got really stoned. And while he was intoxicated on the gas, he got mad at one of the other volunteers, chased him around the room. The audience laughed their heads off. Well, the guy tripped over a bench, banged up his shins really bad. And so Wells comes up to his friend and says, "Man, how are your legs? Look at them, they're all bloody and bruised." And his friend said, "I didn't feel a thing." Well, they didn't have light bulbs at the time, but if they had light bulbs, one would have gone off over Mr. Wells' head. Because Mr. Wells, though he was a dentist, had a bad tooth that needed to be out. He didn't want to have it out because he knew how much it hurt to pull a molar. So what he did is he got the gas man to come to his office the next day, got another dentist who practiced across the hall to come to Wells' office. Wells took a big hit of the laughing gas, had his friend and colleague pull his bad tooth. He didn't feel a thing. And so he and his colleagues both started using nitrous oxide in tooth extractions, and the word spread, and it became fairly common by the mid-19th century to use laughing gas. Just to quickly cut ahead, Wells was an addictive personality, and he didn't fare well with his addictions. He ended up going to Paris, showed the French how to use laughing gas. There's a statue in both Hartford and Paris to Horace Wells as the father of medical anesthesia, because they used it for more than just tooth extractions pretty soon, though, for all sorts of medical procedures. Wells returned to the United States, got to New York City, ran a haberdashery, continued with addictions, and one night when he was intoxicated on another substance, he threw acid on a woman. They arrested him, put him in jail. When he regained his senses, he was ashamed, like a lot of people are. He said to the jailer, "I'd like to shave." They gave him a razor, and he ended his life. Sad ending of the father of laughing gas medical anesthesia. The other father of medical anesthesia only fared a little better. His former student and then partner, William Morton, who by the mid-1840s had moved from Charlton and Hartford to Boston, where he was studying to be a doctor. But he had a wife and family, couldn't really afford the medical classes, had to drop out, had to make his living as a dentist. But he was at a boarding house with a man named Thomas Jackson who taught chemistry at Harvard. And he and Professor Jackson kept talking, and Jackson was experimenting with something that was sulfurous ether. He was getting pets stoned and making them pass out with ether and seeing how much would kill them and how much would just make them sleep and how much would make them wobbly. And so Morton got the idea, well, maybe we could use this on people. And so he started using it in his dental practice, I should say, for tooth extractions. Make the patient go to sleep, pull the tooth, and let him come to much less fighting. And so Morton told some of his former teachers and colleagues at Harvard Medical School, and so they tried it in that big amphitheater. I showed you the picture from 1847. It was only 1846 that he got them to do it in the amphitheater there. The problem was that the doctor was going to remove the physician was going to remove a tumor on the neck or jaw of a fellow. They didn't give him quite enough ether. This is in its beginning stages. It's not an exact science yet. The guy was drowsy, but he wasn't completely out, so he didn't say, "Ah!" but he said, "Oh." And everybody said, "Oh, it's a humbug." You know, he moaned, he groaned. The guy said it hurt a little, but he didn't really feel much. But Morton was embarrassed. He's first off not a doctor, just a dentist. Everybody laughed at him. He was embarrassed and ashamed. And basically, he and Jackson fell out. They tried to patent it as Letheon, gave it a brand name. The patent really didn't hold up because it was just sulfurous ether. It was a really common chemical. And Morton spent the rest of his life trying to get credit for it. 20 some odd years after all this happened, he was impoverished. Some people said, you know, here's the man who gave us the common anesthesia. When I was in 3rd grade and my tonsils out in the 1960s, that's what they gave me, was ether. They don't use it much at all anymore in this country. But anyway, the point is that some of Morton's friends and doctors who never knew him tried to get a subscription up. Let's put some money up and we'll give him a little bit of a cash prize so he doesn't have to die impoverished. Well, somebody wrote an editorial in the newspaper saying, oh, Morton's a bum, he didn't really invent it. It was Morton was so upset when he read it, he had a stroke and died. So, so I tell you 2 tragic stories of the fathers of anesthesia. But if you go to Boston or Cambridge or Charlton, where he's from, where he was born, there's monuments to Morton as the father of medical anesthesia. So pick your father, pick your statue in whatever city you like. So anyway, we'll finish up on this. Today, in the 1800s, this is what mostly killed people. Infectious diseases of infancy and childhood. Things that hardly anybody in this country dies from anymore. Diphtheria, whooping cough, scarlet fever, measles. The things that we all get injections when we're kids. And we hardly ever get those things. Number 2 is tuberculosis. They called it consumption then usually. Anyway, acute infectious disease of adults. Cholera, typhoid fever. How many people do you know that have died of typhoid or typhus or these other things? No. Work accidents, especially related infections, especially men. You cut yourself mowing hay and it gets infected and there's no treatment. There's no antibiotics. And you can die from that. And infectious diseases related to childbirth. A lot of women didn't die in childbirth, but you ran a real risk if you gave birth to postpartum infection, a couple days later, because they didn't know from germ theory, they didn't know from aseptic technique. Doctors often didn't wash their hands. Midwives didn't wash their hands. Today, what kills us mostly is heart disease, cancer, chronic lower respiratory diseases, lung problems like COPD, accidents and unintentional injuries. We have strokes. Alzheimer's disease is on the rise, diabetes, the flu and pneumonia, kidney disease, and suicide. That's 2017, so last year. That's what killed Americans. And, so then basically either minor cuts, burns, scalds could lead to infection, amputation, and half the amputations ended in death. So it was a risky place. But, once common diseases hardly anybody gets today. Like I said, here's a whole list of some of them. Some of us are of an age we can remember getting chicken pox, and now they're telling us, once you're 60, we'll give you a shot, and you hopefully won't get shingles, which is the same virus that just comes back for round 2. But all these things, Americans don't really get malaria much anymore, or polio, although that, certainly went into the 20th century. Anyhow, and a lot of things that we do get can usually be cured, like tuberculosis, or a lot of the hepatitises. But things that we don't get are like smallpox. That the world has largely eradicated, much to the credit of international cooperation. But that was one of the first things to be vaccinated for. 1796, and even before that, in the early 1700s, they start giving people inoculations, basically making a little cut on a healthy person, taking the effluent from an infected pustule on somebody who has the disease, giving it to them to let a healthy person build up some immunity to it. And most of the time it worked. Sometimes they got it and they died, but usually gave them an infection. And then they figured out, Edward Jenner figured out that cowpox, which is similar, he noticed milkmaids in England would get this little rash and then they'd get better. And they never got smallpox. They had wonderful complexions. He figured out you give them cowpox, even if they get cowpox, it doesn't kill you. and but it keeps you from getting smallpox. The reason I put George Washington here is not only because he had smallpox and survived it, but Washington, one of the reasons that he was able to win the Revolution is he forced his soldiers to get inoculated so that they did not get smallpox. And the American army did not suffer a major smallpox outbreak, as many people living in close proximity did then. So that's why I put Washington there. I'm not going to do the rest. I was just going to show you some of the disgusting diseases that we don't get much anymore, like diphtheria and measles and tetanus. Tetanus, lockjaw. You know, every time you go to the emergency room, they say, "When was your last tetanus booster?" This is what happened. You get these seizures that can kill you. I've got it here on the screen. Henry David Thoreau's brother John nicked himself shaving. That's why I don't shave. No, I'm lazy. But for those of you who shave with a blade, you know, you nick yourself, right? You ladies shave your legs, you nick yourself now and again. But you know, without a tetanus free environment or inoculation, you run the risk of getting this, of contracting tetanus, and it can kill you. Anyhow, enough of this. We don't need to go through all these disgusting things. I've kept you for an hour and a half. That's some more recent things, of course. Polio, the iron lung, and they can cure hepatitis. Cholera, death by dehydration. Basically, you get all your fluids going out of you through vomiting and diarrhea, and they can't replenish them. Anyhow, so we've come a long way with medicine, and we live longer lives, certainly. We live happier lives, healthier lives. We can replace joints. We can replace many organs. We can do all sorts of therapies. There's much better analgesia nowadays. But in the end, even today, nobody gets out alive. So anyway, I'm sorry I've rambled on so long.